Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, Modern Russian here at EOU. Today's lesson is going to discuss briefly um, World War II for Russia. So pretty interesting topic. We have some really good readings on this. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope it's helpful. Brief rundown. This is just chronology. You don't have to freak out and start scribbling down notes here. I just wanted to give you a rundown of the movement up to World War II. Of course, I mentioned Hitler appointed as chancellor in 1933 after he got 39% of the vote. He begins rearming. He pulls Germany out of the League of Nations. In 1936, Hitler occupies the Rhineland, and the Rhineland was basically a demilitarized zone that was on the border of France. France had, encouraged the creation of this area at the end of World War II for fear of another German invasion. In 1938, Hitler took Austria. He also obtains the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia as a result of the Munich Conference. In 1939, he, of course, invades Poland. After that, he's going to invade Denmark, France, Norway at the beginning, using his blitzkrieg military strategy. Italy's war began in the 30s as well, attempting particularly to recolonize Ethiopia. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1932. By 1937, they invaded China proper. The Japanese theater of war in China was incredibly brutal, not on a scale unlike the Nazis, though there wasn't per se a mass industrial slaughter, but there was tremendous war crimes, horrible war crimes, particularly during the rape of Nanjing in 1937. Japan has to create an empire for the need of resources, and so as a result of that, their imperial goals really do head up against the United States. Here, the area of the Sudetenland, if you look to, as you're facing the screen, if you look to the right, and you see the little kind of triangular thing sticking into eastern Germany, that is the so-called Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and that is what the Allies, with over here on your left is Neville Chamberlain, and of course Hitler's in the middle. The French Prime Minister is between Neville Chamberlain and Hitler. But this is Munich 1938. The Allies made an agreement, without even really consulting the Czechoslovakians actually, to give Germany the Czech Sudetenland. Hitler was demanding it because he said these people were truly German people, and that Germany had a right to control this area. Neville Chamberlain, of course, famously lands in London and steps off the plane with the treaty in his hand, saying, "We've achieved peace in our time." It was one of the most ironic and tragic events in history because, of course, only a year later, the war would really begin as Hitler blitzed into Poland. Chamberlain, of course, would be removed as prime minister and replaced ultimately by Winston Churchill. So this map depicts World War II at the height of Nazi German influence. And, of course, particularly it depicts the areas that the Germans use when they invade into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, led by Stalin, very much believed that world wars were an inevitability. Communist ideology asserted that world wars were inevitable components of the capitalist world order. So Stalin certainly, he certainly believed that a world war would happen and was possible as Hitler started rearming and moving through Europe. Of course, Stalin also desperately wanted to prevent the Nazis from invading the Soviet Union. And he very much deceived himself on this reality right on up to the very end in many ways. At the outset, just before the Nazis invaded Poland, of course, the Nazi Ambassador Ribbentrop, Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, met with Molotov, met with Stalin, and they created the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which was an alliance between the Nazis and the Soviets. And this was basically an agreement that assured the Soviet Union that the Nazis did not have designs on invading the USSR. Of course, if anybody had read, if anybody were paying attention to what Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, it was clearly telegraphed that his eyes were set on the Soviet Union. But Stalin signs the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact as a way of hoping that he can avoid war with Nazi Germany. And as the war began, of course, after Munich, by 1939, of course, Hitler's first move was to attack Poland, and Poland is attacked, and Poland becomes divided as Stalin takes the opportunity of Soviet action in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, to also move his troops into Poland and to also attempt to subjugate Finland. The Soviet Union brutally repressed the Polish people and committed many, many atrocities in Poland, most infamous of them being the Katyn massacre in Poland, massacre of intellectuals and Polish leaders. The Soviet incursion into Finland does not work quite as well, though. And even though there was a treaty agreement with the Finns after the Soviet hurrah into Finland, in reality, I mean, the agreement gave them a little more space around Leningrad or Petersburg, but the Finnish actually really did an amazing job of fending off the Soviets and being able to obtain and maintain their neutrality. Famously, Finns in that invasion fought on skis against a large, rather lumbering and cumbersome Soviet conventional army. And the Finns fought on skis and used the terrain to their advantage. But Stalin very much believed till the very last moment before Operation Barbarossa, which was launched June 22nd, 1941, Stalin had very much convinced himself that this was not going to happen. That even when the Nazis were clearly moving themselves into position, Stalin had sort of deceived himself as to the reality. And he had failed to properly prepare his defenses, and he had failed to properly consider relocations of industry. He does ultimately relocate his war industries back behind the Ural Mountains after the invasion and after Moscow is being threatened, but all of this stuff was far too late. And of course, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, Stalin plunged into what some theorized was a nervous breakdown. And during the war, he only appeared several times. And this was not because he was incapacitated. It was just because he preferred to keep out of the public eye. But when the invasion was underway, Stalin was shocked. And he was slow to deploy his troops to react. And he seemed by many to enter into a reclusive state out of shock over his being deceived, because Stalin understood that he had been tricked. Stalin understood at that point that he had been duped, that he had been so concerned that he reassured himself that this would not happen. Of course, the Operation Barbarossa is a terrible failure, and the Germans, the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa far too late in the year for it to have possibly worked. The Nazis were, of course, motivated in part by a deeply racist perspective of Russians and of Slavic peoples, and Hitler assumed because of this that this portion of the world would simply fall in a short period of time, and of course could not have been more wrong. In many ways, of course, the success for the Soviet Union carried out by many members of the occupied territories of the Germans, of the Nazis, came as a result of the fact, not that Mother Russia, as the Soviet Union trumped up as this is Mother Russia and war for the fatherland, many people were fighting ultimately with Stalin and the Soviet Union far less because of the goodness or benefits of the Soviet Union, and far more because it was clear that the Nazis were assuring them slavery, murder, and repression. And so the Nazi danger and the Nazi threat was slightly worse than the threat posed by Stalin during the conflict. And that's one of the reasons why many people in places like the Ukraine ultimately fought on the side of Stalinist Russia. These various shades show you the different courses of the Nazi invasion. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was really a three-front invasion, and it was deeply flawed for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was a three-front invasion, so it aimed at Kiev in the south, Moscow in the middle, and Leningrad or Petersburg in the north. And the Nazis had incredible problems with logistic lines. The entire Nazi military was not fully mechanized, and so there were some divisions in some of these lines that moved far faster than other lines because Hitler had effectively refused to fully mobilize his home front. And so there was one of the main fronts of this attack went into Russia without being a fully mechanized unit. In addition to this, Russia was large, and I mean, you can look at the map; it's just obvious how big it is. And the Nazis did not have the ability to do air supply effectively after the Nazis had moved into their full expanse in Russia. In addition to this, the Russian railroad gauges, the track gauges, the space between the tracks, were different sizes, and so Nazi trains, German trains, wouldn't run on the Soviet tracks. The Nazis also, Hitler had his military invade Russia later than what should have been expected, and many in the Nazi high command had tried to convince Hitler not to invade in 41. I'm sorry, and the reason for this was because the fact was that they were going to face a significant problem with the winter. They had to outrun the winter and the Russian winter. And in 1941, the spring thaw came late, and so because of that, when you would have ideally wanted to go in May, the streams and rivers were all overrun. It was far too muddy. You couldn't operate in those conditions, and so they waited. And it was in June 22nd, when they invaded in 1941, and this is a huge blunder. Of course, the Nazis will make it almost to Moscow, and many of the Nazi soldiers had no cold weather gear. Many froze to death in absolutely horrid conditions that sometimes were so cold that the fuel inside the tanks, in some cases, even froze. And so the Nazis push to the edge of the Soviet frontier. They siege St. Petersburg or Leningrad in the north. They reach within really earshot of the capital city, Moscow, where Stalin was. Stalin had moved the industry behind the Urals to protect them. And then, of course, in the south, the push towards Stalingrad. And if you see the light blue, I can't point out exactly where it's at right now, but if you see the light blue component of this that goes around the Black Sea area, it's right on the edge of the darker blue and the light blue where Stalingrad is. And Stalingrad, of course, becomes one of the most horrifying battles of the war. It was at Stalingrad where the Russians, who were desperately in need of material support, the Russians at Stalingrad sent troops into battle with, in some cases, only a gun, and another soldier was sent behind them with a magazine of bullets. And the command was that when the individual in front of you is shot, pick up their gun and use it. If you tried to run away, you would be shot. And military commanders were sent to the gulags by Stalin. Military commanders were executed by Stalin before and during the war. So it was a very desperate and brutal situation. Stalingrad was a long siege in which the Nazis were caught inside the city and were sieged. There's also, in the Ukraine, you also have during this period one of the largest, in the Battle of Kursk, you have one of the largest tank battles in the history of warfare. It remained the largest tank battle into, I believe, the 1970s during the Arab-Israeli War. So massive fighting in the Soviet sector, tremendous casualties, and largely, of course, the Soviet Union's struggle against the Nazis was probably the biggest reason for the defeat of the Nazis. Stalin, and this is an important thing I want to note, Stalin believed that the Soviet Union needed a buffer zone, an empire in the eastern portion of Europe, to protect itself against potential wars in the West. And when the Nazis went into Poland, and Stalin immediately went into Finland and the eastern half of Poland, these were moves by Stalin to consolidate a sort of security buffer zone on the edge of the Soviet Union. And after the Nazis' invasion of the Soviet Union, it only reinforces Stalin's drive to have this buffer zone. And so as the Soviets begin to push back the Nazis towards Berlin, the Soviets ultimately began to, under Stalin, make moves to occupy and seize territories and bring them under their control in one way or another. Territories like Poland, East Germany, that would provide the Soviet Union with supplies, with resources, with war reparations in the case of East Germany, and a buffer zone to protect against the Western wars. Stalin did definitely during the war give promises to the Allies about. He disbanded the Comintern, which was the international communist element. He implied to them that he did not desire to spread communism into Europe. But of course, at the end of the war, largely out of an interest for his own security, the Stalin's, Soviet Union's own security, Stalin insists on really creating a sort of imperial buffer zone that really he had been trying to put together, as war began as part of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. So World War II in a lot of ways really leads to the Cold War in some respects, as Stalin's acquisition of Poland, of East Germany, in places like this, played a central factor in the crystallization of a polarizing divide between East and West, particularly over these territories. I also, make a note that, of course, Stalin and the United States were allies during the war, of course, and Stalin and the Soviet Union raced for Berlin. The United States moved more cautiously towards Berlin, and ultimately were willing to allow the Russians to take Berlin. And this was largely because Eisenhower was trying to limit casualties. But the Soviet Union very much rushed towards Berlin, and in the process began indirectly attempting to take power in areas of Eastern Europe that could act as this buffer zone. There were tensions between the Allies and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union received Lend-Lease just like everybody else, but a lot of Lend-Lease didn't go to the Soviet Union. Likewise, after the fall of Germany, despite at Yalta, when he met with Truman and Roosevelt, Stalin had been assured continued assistance for Lend-Lease in exchange for his assistance in the Japanese front of the war. Well, after the fall of Germany, Harry Truman and the new president cut off that Lend-Lease, and after the development of the atomic bomb, which Truman notified, albeit he already knew, Truman notified Stalin at Potsdam, that we had this weapon, Stalin still was intent on using the situation to try to exert his influence in Asia, hence his movement into Manchuria. And the United States' use of the atomic bombs was to a large degree to keep the Soviets from actually joining the occupation of mainland Japan. So this is a picture of, famously Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, or Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, at Yalta in 1945. This conference in the beginning, February of 1945. And it was at this conference where there were some of the decisions, or at least implications of decisions, were made regarding the war's end. Of course, you notice the obvious difference in the posture with Roosevelt and Churchill in civilian clothes, and of course looking somewhat jovial, versus Stalin with the sort of icy gaze here, and then that is suggestive of a lot. One of the big questions here at Yalta was what to be done about conquered territories. Stalin was increasingly insisting on a buffer zone. And Churchill actually had met with Stalin privately, and Churchill had suggested in a mathematic strategy to Stalin's desire to basically acquire control of large amounts of Eastern Europe, the countries of Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, and so forth. And he suggested, granting the Soviet Union spheres of influence in that region, that they would be granted a sphere of influence in particular areas of Eastern Europe. Of course, Roosevelt was horrified by that. Roosevelt in the United States believed the war was being fought for self-determination. That was part of the key motivating factors of the war, was self-determination. And the United States very much did not want to suggest to Stalin that we would acquiesce amid his attempts to basically occupy and control Eastern Europe as a way of setting up a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Of course, they agreed that the three main powers, and the French resistance as well, would occupy Germany collectively and Berlin collectively. But that was a different story. They very much didn't see eye to eye on what to do about these territories. And Stalin took some of the things that FDR said as implying to him a right to control Poland, for example. But in reality, the FDR administration was highly opposed to Stalin's attempt to control these areas. In addition to this, Yalta was important because Roosevelt had to kind of encourage Stalin to help out with Japan after the war in Europe was over. We had not tested an atomic bomb at this time, and so certainly Roosevelt implied to Stalin certain leniency, shall we say, when it came to Stalin's interests in Eastern Europe. At least in word, he might have implied certain things that Stalin would have taken one way or another as a way of encouraging Stalin to help out with the war effort in Japan. And, of course, Stalin does do this, and he intends to do this, and he, after the death of FDR, in fact, eagerly comes to try to do this as a way not of benevolently helping the United States, but more as a way of, again, securing territories for Soviet power. Stalin will go into Manchuria. The United States dropped the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb largely because we were trying to prevent Stalin from becoming part of an Allied occupation of Japan. Greatly feared the dividing. The United States greatly feared the division of Japan. So Stalin very much was interested in the creation of spheres of influence, and it was something that the United States had to, and the British had to deal with. There were a lot of natural animosities as well. The Soviet Union was a recipient of Lend-Lease, but largely because of their cold water ports, they received less Lend-Lease aid than Stalin would have liked. The Soviet Union, Stalin had insisted time and time again that the United States create a third front. Particularly, he was referring to a D-Day front on Europe. and the United States and the British delayed that. And actually, Churchill went to Moscow and told Stalin about the North African invasion planned for 1943. And Stalin was not amused at these little sideshows. He felt that the United States should have gone right ahead with the D-Day early. He felt the Allies were very much allowing the Russians to bleed the war. Stalin was also put off, of course, by U.S. secrecy with the bomb. And so there's a lot of reasons developing at this time that ultimately are going to factor importantly into the crystallization of a Cold War after World War II, as Stalin and the Soviet Union will seek spheres of influence, and the United States also as a way of defense will seek its own spheres of influence. One other thing I will note, I should also say, the crystallization of this Cold War was also encouraged by Stalin's relationship with the new President Truman. Of course, FDR dies in April of 1945. FDR dies. Truman becomes president, and Truman canceled after the defeat of Germany. Truman canceled the Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, and these types of overtures certainly were the beginning of an establishment of a kind of very confrontational relationship between Truman and Stalin and the Soviet Union. And of course, war, the war from the Soviet perspective was incredibly brutal. Many people were thrown in prisons. Some people were released from prison only to be used as minesweepers in military campaigns. It was a brutal period for the Soviet Union, and domestically, in many cases, as well as to the military, the reign of terror continued by Stalin as a way of mandating the mobilization of his people. Okay, guys, I hope this is helpful.